Ben is doing tableware.
When the Beans, which were considered the first settlers that came into Tennessee in 1769, what was life like for them on the frontier, and how long did it take for us to be able to establish settlements that were substantial enough to start bringing in stores and tradespeople and those sorts of things. And we know that by the time the Beans had made that settlement, just about almost simultaneously, the other settlers moved in with them. So Tennessee, coming from North Carolina and then from Virginia, came in very quickly after those initial treaties were signed with the Cherokees. And so the settlements began to really kick off. Well, in those settlements, as you can imagine, people want to have things because they were used to having things in Virginia and North Carolina. They weren't just destitute when they came here. One thing that I had to learn as I do the research is the fact that people weren't living on dirt floors. They weren't used to living that way. They weren't used to living just in hovels of kinds of buildings. They weren't used to just grubbing for everything they had to do when they were just like they were on a hunt. But when they came back home to their villages or to their communities, they wanted to have the nicer things that they had been used to living with from North Carolina and Virginia. And so those are sort of the things that we see very quickly that come into Tennessee territory. The Great Wagon Road that came from the north, from Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston, was already open by this time. And so wagons began to move those supplies back and forth from those areas of north into the Tennessee territory. Jonesboro being our first town in the state of Tennessee in 1779, 1780, had already established, and just within a few years they had 30 buildings established in the long street there in Jonesboro. Are you familiar with the town of Jonesboro? So they already had 30 buildings established there, and by 3 years later they had 150 buildings established with already about 5 or 6 general merchandise stores that were selling all kinds of things. And what I've done here is I've taken three years of 3 different stores and from their journals and listed some items that were available to be purchased. And these were the things that they purchased. And you'll see that number 1 on the first page was something I had to look up myself. What is that? It's a boiler. And I was thinking a boiler, we use boilers for, heating up our furnaces kinds of things. But this was a table set piece that sat on a table that was used to keep your gravy and special sauce warm during your meal. And I'm thinking, that's pretty sophisticated, to do that. And so, that sort of gives you a little bit different picture of what their life was like sitting at their dining table. The first store that you'll see there is Cheeks Crossroads. Is anybody familiar with that store? It was established, I think initially 1790, I think about 1790, where Russellville is, Morristown, okay? It was right at the edge of Russellville, just on the southern edge of Russellville. And the other store in there, you'll see the next store is Bent Creek, and that's on the other side of Russellville on the stage road heading to Bull's Gap. It's about 2 miles from Bull's Gap, still on the old stage road. And you'll see that those stores are operating already at that level, selling those kinds of goods in that store. Some of the things that you'll see there, also number 7 on the first page, casters. Here it is, between 1795 and 1800, you've got these kinds of things sitting on the table. And these are not just one of. Here's the Bent Creek Store Journal that has already been transcribed. But in here it lists, the clerk is listing every time those items are sold. In Jonesboro, by 1800, there were already, in that 1 year of 1800, I think there were 375 customers that bought items that 1 year. And I didn't count up all of the items that were sold in that 1 year, but it's tremendous. It's several hundred different items that they were available to purchase. And I just listed just the ones that were used for cooking or on the table, as you can see there. Delft bowls. Are you familiar with those? Are very colorful, decorative items that they were using as everyday wear. You go on down through there, you'll see cream ewers for cream pitchers, honey pots for sweetening things as well as sugar, but you were using that honey pot to actually add with your chocolate, believe it or not. And you had a specific chocolate pot. You have a teapot, a coffee pot, and a chocolate pot. And all of those were sold in these store journals, in these stores in Tennessee at this time period. Soup ladles, mustard pots, mustard bottles, all kinds of cinnamon and spices, allspice, nutmeg graters. All of these things were available for them to purchase in the stores, and they did. Another thing that you see, we'll look at out here, are the types of plateware that they were using. Early on, we may have used, in the earlier colonial period, maybe even before coming to Tennessee, you had trineware, which are wooden vessels, wooden cups, wooden plates, wooden spoons. You might have even had the horn spoons, and you'll see some of those out there on the table. Those would be very early, but they still transitioned through the period of this time period for the early Tennesseans. But very quickly, when these items were coming from Baltimore and Philadelphia and even Boston down the wagon road, they were getting everything that they could get coming in from ship from all over the world. And to anybody, if you were living in New York, you were living in Jonesboro, you could get exactly the same thing. It didn't matter. There are accounts where the carriages, and you could actually order things. There are individuals in Jonesboro that are making an order for very specific things that they want. He tells the storekeeper that's what he wants. The storekeeper's the next wagon going back to Richmond, where they warehoused a lot of it. And then the order went on to Philadelphia and New York, Baltimore, and then within a time period it came back, and it says, per your order, here it is. This is what you ordered. So they could get anything they wanted from that. Any questions so far?
It seems to me that everything you're talking about would be something that people with means and who had a connection with their homeland where things were a bit fancier. So you're talking about that level of society as opposed to poor Appalachians, for example.
Well, and you would think that, but I think it's just like, this is my personal opinion. After reading as many of these journals as I've gone through and looking at the population numbers in these communities, everybody's buying the same thing. They are aspiring to be able to have what everybody else is having. Just like today, we want the latest fashion. Okay? And so they're wanting the latest fashion, they're wanting the latest thing, plus they're also remembering what their life was like in Virginia, North Carolina. And so they're really trying to incorporate those kinds of things back into their lifestyle. So, you know, the primitiveness that we like to romantically think about, that this was dirt floors and nothing, and they made everything themselves, was not actually the case, as I'm learning. So. On the last couple of pages, you'll see some examples of some things I just took and made some color images of, so you'll see. One of the things that is pretty evident is what was called, as far as the plates, were the creamware and the queensware, the creamware, and the pearlware. And I have some examples out there. You'll see that pretty much there's what they call the brew edge or the green edge plates and platters and dishes and sets. And you'll see that out there. And that was really common in everyday sales in the store journals. But as we mentioned earlier, you know, the chocolate very early on is coming in. Actually, the cocoa bean is coming from South America, coming into the mills around Charleston, actually. And then they were heating the beans up, drying them, processing them, and basically getting it into powder. And then whenever you got it here, and you mixed it with honey or whatever it is, and you then turned it into a cream, put it in a mold, and let it dry. And you could either buy it that way, or you could buy it already in the dried containers you see on the one of the last pages. And then they would take that chocolate, which wasn't nearly as sweet as we like it today, but they could add things to it. They would add milk to it, they would add more sugar to it, and then drink it like we do today, like hot chocolate. Other items, have you ever heard of turkey cotton?
Mm-mm.
Turkey cotton is actually a red color, and it's a cotton that comes from the country of exactly where it says Turkey, and it's very prevalent in the store journal. Everybody's buying turkey cotton, everybody's buying indigo, everybody's buying different colors and dyes of things to dye different materials with. You'll also notice that and they're trading back, or they're bartering back to the store. They're bartering back, like he said, feathers, but they're also bartering back eggs and different things of that nature. But they're also bartering back thread. They're spinning. There's a lot of spinning going on. So they're taking, they're buying flaxseed, making sure they have a flax crop, turning it into the flax material, and then turning that flax into linen. And then they'll sell the linen thread back to the stores. Any other questions about that? Here's an example of some of the store journals. You see some of mine. Yeah. But it's all in original handwriting. You can see that.
Hold some over this direction. Okay.
And of these, we have, so far in East Tennessee, we have the John and Robert Allen store in Jonesboro, the David Diedrich store in Jonesboro, and they also had stores in Maryville and Knoxville and Greenville at the same time period. The Cheeks Crossroads store, the Neely store, and Bench Creek store, and there are others that we're looking at as well, going back into those records and discovering these kinds of things from this very early Tennessee period. Now, I think one of the things that Donna will give you is like a quick cheat sheet on, if she hasn't given you this already, the period of when these material would have been used on the tables. If she hasn't gotten you one, she'll get you one of these. And so basically it just deals with the type of plateware, tableware that was used at certain periods of time. And of course, all of this would have been used in Tennessee. So it's just not, so just keep that in mind. You go down through here. In the store journals, you will see on the end, knife and forks were sold in sets. But if you'll notice, very rarely you see what?
A spoon.
You don't see a spoon. The spoon was not sold with the set. It was always a knife and fork set together. Anybody know why that was the case? Have you ever watched anybody from England eat?
Yeah.
They don't eat with a spoon, do they?
They still don't.
They still don't. And that's basically because we were what when we were colonists here? We were what? English colonists.
Yeah.
And so to get rid of that, even though we had the American Revolution, we were still English. And still those English traditions. We were still under English common law, English customs, and so that's sort of the thing. That's the reason that it was still common for them to do that. So it's a knife and fork sets that you see here. Also, one of the neat things that you'll notice if you look at this knife, it looks weird, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it looks that way? Well, they had butter knives that look similar to this, right? But what do we do with usually the butter?
Spread.
We put it on the flat up here, right? And it allows us to spread it. Well, when you're eating with your knife and fork, you're eating like this. Fork upside down, your finger on top. And so then you are pushing the food up onto the flat part of your knife, and then you're eating from your knife, not your spoon. And that's the custom of how you would do that. And so that's the reason why you'll see some of these that are much broader on the ends for that purpose. Donna, do I tell them the rhyme?
Sure.
I just told it up in Cardinal Town, so yes.
Go ahead.
When I was small, of course, your grandmother always teaches you all kinds of things, and my family is very English, Barrington. My mother's side is Scotch-Irish, but we're Barrington, Scotch-Irish, English and Scotch-Irish both. And so the things that she would tell me all go back to what her grandmother, and it's like that perpetual stories that get told. And one of the stories, the rhymes that she would teach us as small children was, it would say, I eat my peas with honey. I've done it all my life. It makes the peas taste funny, but it keeps them on the knife. As we go down the table, we'll see the first set that we see here is what is called redware. Some of the redware was made locally, but by the time early Tennessee was being established, they were still importing this from the redware potters up in the New England area. So bringing that down, but they were still using it. You'll next see some woodenware pieces that you see here, the trineware, so the transitional, they're still using the woodenware. As a matter of fact, we use woodenware dough bowls all the way up into the early 20th century. You know, my grandmother still used a wooden dough bowl. And so that trineware was still being used, but they still had the other pieces. And that's one thing to remember, is that a lot of these things were transitional. If they were still usable, you know, they just kept using it. Maybe for over 100 years, they just kept using it. But the trineware that you'll see here, the next thing we look at are some of the pewter objects. There's horn spoons. You'll see a traveling knife and fork here. Wooden trays, wooden bowls. Early glassware, blown glassware. You'll see here early glass goblets, blown goblets. You'll see, and all of this are in the store journals. Every piece of it. Candle stands for the tables or for your use. You'll see them buying a single candle stand, a set of candle stands. These are the earlier 18th century style. The antique dealers call this, you know what they call this today? It's called a hog scraper because of the way it's shaped. I don't know if that's, just doesn't call it that in the store journal, but that's what these are. They just call them, it's iron made candle stands. Coming on down here is another original redware pitcher that would have been used. This is the pearlsware or the queensware that it talks about in the store journals you see on your page there.
What's
This
the
is
date, Dan, when that showed up?
This is probably 1780, 1770. That one is. There was a little bit of this coming in before the Revolution, but most of it comes in right after the Revolution as trade. And remember, you know, we're Americans, but we were originally British. And what were we originally here for? We were here to supply raw material to England. We were part of English economy to produce a raw material to them. And in turn, we were then to buy back finished goods. And consequently, that's what was really going on while the Revolution began, because we were doing that, but we began to feel like, okay, yeah, we're buying your finished goods, but why are you taxing us going out and taxing us coming in? And so that's really where the Revolution began. And so that's what you were seeing here. But still, after the Revolution is over, as a matter of fact, during the Revolution, the big issue with the colonists that are American now during the Revolution, what did they quit doing? Okay, come on. I got to have some history people.
Paying taxes.
Well, they quit paying taxes, but they also quit drinking
Tea.
tea. As a matter of fact, the teas before the Revolution was what was called a gunpowder tea or an imperial tea, which were English teas that were processed from India that were shipped over. But they quit doing that. They started drinking rose tea and Hibson tea, which was a tea that they could get here themselves. And so they continued to drink tea, just wasn't the English bought tea. But after the Revolution is over, guess what happens? They get the old tea bag. So they can continue to drink the English tea. Up until, guess when?
War of 1812.
War of 1812. Unpatriotic if you drink English tea again. So we go back to drinking Hibson tea and rose tea again. So that's what happened. But in any case, those items that were coming from England, just at those two periods of time, ceased coming. The Americans had to start making do of their own. But as soon as those wars were over, then they welcomed the goods back again. So that's what we're seeing.
It's the blue and the green. Okay. So this was American made,
No, this is all English.
all still
This
English.
is all English. As a matter of fact, this is Boston. Some of the early redware pieces could be American. These two are American glass from right around 1800, 1790s to 1800s. And then from here on, we begin to get more American. But most of this, as far as tableware, is English. From Staffordshire, England, Leeds area. Another thing you'll see also that Randall talked about are butcher knives. They sell lots of butcher knives for the kitchen table. Also carving knives, and I have a carving knife, but I didn't have a carving fork. But things like this, period carving knife. Salts. Talked about salt and the horn. If you're out hunting, if you're on the table, you would have a salt for the table, and then you would have a salt spoon that you would have here. Here's an
Salt
earlier
cellar.
one. I'm sorry.
It's a salt cellar.
Yes, the salt cellar. And that's exactly what it's called. And then here's a later Victorian one, still using the salt. Here. Anybody know what this one is?
That's the pepper pot. Pepper pot.
Yeah, it's close. Very similar. This is a sugar shaker. They say sugar. The pepper pot was very similar. All right, I think a pepper pot was this one. This is a mustard pot. Opened it, you would process your mustard into the mustard consistency and dip it out with your spoon and apply the condiment to your food. And these are pewter. And of course, pewter spoons, you'll see on there in your handout the pewter mold for making the pewter spoon mold to make the pewter spoons. A lot of these were made locally. These were not usually imported. Let's see. These are teapots. This is an 18th century teapot from about 1780. And this is an 1810 to 1820 teapot from Boston. It's actually marked on the bottom. Boston maker. There. But pewter, a lot of the pewter pieces were not imported by this time period. They were already begun to make their own pewter pieces. Decanting. You heard of the word decanting?
Yep.
What's that mean?
You put it in, you let it settle, and then you pour the top off.
Pour the top off, and then once you did that, you put it in a decanter. And this is how you served your liqueur. You'll see in the store journals a lot of things that are wines, port wines, but also something called cherry bounce. And that's an alcoholic sweet drink, like a sweet liqueur. Everybody in Tennessee loved cherry bounce. They loved that almost as much as they loved their whiskey. And this is another earlier one. This is an 18th century, what is called a bottle. This was a part of a case of bottles that would have gone together with different kinds of liqueurs in it. And it was a wooden case, piece of nice box with a lid on it. And the bottles would go in there with the wine glasses or the drink glasses, much smaller than these, but of course they were there. There's another interesting glass that I discovered in there too. It's called a gill glass. Ever heard of that?
Gill?
Gill.
Oh.
It's a gill glass. It's actually a firing glass. And what a firing glass was for table use or tavern use, and it had a thick bottom on it. And whenever you ran out of your liqueur, if you're sitting at your table, you would wrap that glass on the table and let the barmaid know you're ready for more. And when you had a group of men around the table rapping on that, it sounded like a battle going on. And so they were called firing glasses. So that's a gill glass. A stock glass was another term they used. And that's one of, usually a goblet type of glass like these. There were straight-sided glasses as well, common glass that they would have used, but they would have been this way. A lot of them would have been etched, engraved. This one is sort of not etched. This one's not etched. I do have some that are etched, but you can see the decoration around them. This one actually, this one came from a house here in Tennessee. So this was actually used early in the early Tennessee settlement. Let's see. And when we get down to this end, we begin to get toward the middle to the latter part of the 19th century. So you see these types of pressed glass patterns in this. And of course, pieces like this, pressed glass, patterned glass. Flow blue, heard of that type of things. We still have the knife and fork sets. Here we have an early set, but toward the mid to the latter part of the 19th century with wooden handles. Still, we pick up an extra tine in the middle of them. And then we still with a knife and fork set, but what, do you recognize the handles on this? This is plastic. This is the first plastic Bakelite that you have. And so we still see the knife and fork sets even at this later period of the 1900s. Lusterware, you've heard of those. And then the common ironstone that we have here. This piece actually is from 1855, but it transcends almost all the way through this whole period of this white ironstone type material. Tin cups, tinware, silver plated ware that we see here, actual silver pieces. We had two silversmiths in Jonesboro in the first quarter of the first quarter of the 19th century. Actually, he was there by the late 1700s. We have George B. From the very first family is considered the first silversmith in the territory of Tennessee. They were getting silver and using it in their households. Any questions? Yes.
I have a silly question. I notice you have forks that are 2 prongs, 3 prongs, and 4 prongs. What is the significance around that?
Usually what we see, the earlier are 2-prong forks.
Yeah.
And then as we go through the time period, they add an extra time as we get later in time. And we then transfer to basically from doing this, if you're right-handed like I am, instead of doing this, what do? We as America, we switched. And then we switched to how we used it, like this. So we move away from that British custom to the American custom of eating. And then we incorporate the spoon back as part of the set. Any other question?
What's the little brown one that has the little lid on it?
This is a tea caddy. That's what it had tea in it.
That's an unusual piece. Very colorful.
This one?
Design,
Yes.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Now, this is a replica, but this could have been an American-made piece. This would have been a pottery piece that would be reminiscent of what the Germans would have brought into Pennsylvania at the time, as well as these pieces like this redware. So this is an early redware material, which is distinctive by its clay, and what they were using to make the pottery with. And then very colorful decorative pieces in the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s actually. Any other questions?
So, you kind of sort of tied into this. So, obviously most of our early traditions come from English, and we consider ourselves largely English, but how much both items and customs came from other things that were other than English? Because obviously we had people from like Germany and other parts of Europe who were coming here as well.
Of course, we have a lot of French wines We have a lot and there are some French influences in the tableware pieces. I don't think I have a piece of it here today, but there are some French influences. There are quite a bit of German influences in things, like I mentioned with these colorful pieces here. Delft from France is one, and you'll see that. I think that's even on the first page. So they're buying things that are coming from France. So we do have immigrants at that point in time that are coming with the British from other parts of the world. There are other, usually most of them are from, if they're not English or Irish, they're coming from Germany. But there are some French influences coming in.
Yeah, because we did have going all the way back before the Revolutionary French and Indian War. With those Fort Toulouse and all that.
When you get west of the Mississippi, north of this area, the southeastern or the eastern seaboard, then you have a lot more French influence.
And out west you have Spanish influence.
Yeah, and we still have Spanish influence in Georgia and Florida too at that time.
I assume they didn't have bubble wrap, so how did they transport this delicate dinnerware?
Actually, there is now. I don't know how the English did it, but I do know how the Chinese did it when they brought over Chinese porcelain. They wrapped them in. It didn't get wrapped. It was barreled in seeds from the empress tree called Paulownia. Now, if you know what Paulownia is, we have lots of it here.
That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem here today. And it's because the seeds of the Paulownia tree, when they were using those seeds to pack with, because they're just great packing peanuts, and they would pack them into the crates with the china. They would get here off the ship, and they would start unboxing them. All those seeds the wind would catch them and blow, and that's the way it would be. And then now we have Paulownia trees everywhere.
We do.
Now there was this discussion, I think, about oil and flints the other day, wasn't there? Black flint. Yeah, the black flints, and were they actually packed in oil when they sent the flints for the rifles, because they came from Europe through the English trade system, and they said, well, they were packed in barrels with oil in them. And then one fellow said, well, that makes a lot of sense, because once you got the flints out, then you got all the oil to use. So it's carriages in the store journals as well. They'll talk about the carriages and the price that it took to bring the wagon load from Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston to Jonesboro. So it talks about that.
Yeah.
Now it was a pretty good run. The one thing I did discover too is that I think I mentioned it earlier. In Richmond, they warehoused it, and so they brought things down to Richmond, and each store owner would have a specific portion of the warehouse or a warehouse himself in Richmond that he would then order those goods to be shipped to wherever he wanted them to go to in East Tennessee, either to Jonesboro, Greenville, or any of the other stores, Knoxville, Maryville, that was available at that time.
Did you mention that piece with the screen on it? Is that for flies, or
Yes.
to keep flies out?
Yes.
Butter or cheese or what?
Yep, butter and cheese to keep flies out. And how many of you ever, now that you mentioned that, one thing I didn't mention is that this is a pewter mug. And how many of you ever heard of a tankard? What's the difference?
It has a lid on it
Why does it have a lid?
to keep the flies out.
To keep the flies out. When did the tankard go out of fashion in Tennessee, actually, and in the colonies? And you have to think about this. It goes out in the late 1700s. You're thinking, well, if it's doing that purpose of keeping those flies out, why do we not keep the lid on the tankard? The specialists have decided that sanitation had improved so much by the time they didn't need the lids anymore.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
And we begin to see that in a lot of things, that those things begin to change due to sanitation efforts. And I heard somebody talk about their sanitation earlier. I always was told that they didn't take baths. I thought, whoa, man, that must smell bad. If they didn't take baths, why did they buy so much flavored or scented soap? Bars of soap. From 1795, and I'm going to do an analysis of this to do the count. How many bars of soap were purchased by the stores in East Tennessee? It is a lot. I already know there's several hundred per year of bars of soap. Windsor soap, Rose soap. There's another soap. There's another soap called Castile soap. They buy a lot of soap. And this is soap that they could be making, but they're choosing to buy this soap at the store. And it comes in little squares, just like you see today. So if they're not bathing with it, what are they doing with it?
I believe they're putting it in their clothes, where their clothes are stored in the trunks.
Maybe.
Yeah,
Washing their clothes in.
that's a pretty common thing.
But one of the things I've started doing research on that too, and now they're sort of, the specialists are beginning to change their mind on that people didn't take baths.
Oh,
People did take baths.
Once a
Yeah.
week, at least once a week.
Maybe
Well-
Saturday night.
Yeah.
Well, they did take baths, they did use soap, and they really bathed more frequently than we have been led to believe. And so that's a new piece of information that, research is bringing to light. So, any other information or questions about what we have here?
So you brought up stuff being made out of wood and horns and how that transitioned down the road. Was that stuff that they just kept it around and did, because why buy new stuff when you already have it? Or was it, hey, this is cheaper so that I can get that instead of getting the nicer stuff that's already available?
Well, I think any of this would have transitioned in time. And of course, when Randall talked about using those types of implements, you're out to where you don't want to take a lot of this stuff. You want to go light, number one, and you want to have something that's usable. Well, the horn cup is the old plastic. You would take a plastic something with you today. Well, that horn was the plastic of the day. And it was pretty readily available because there were lots of cattle here in East Tennessee by this time. So you could get horn anytime you wanted it, just about. It was a good trade item, and so it's easily, a product that's easily made. And so if you would keep using it as long as it's still serviceable.
You didn't take your good stuff out.
Yeah, you didn't take your good stuff out. Your best stuff you took was your rifle. And you had to keep it in pretty good shape.
Yet some of the earliest dwellings in Knoxville, this is the first cabins that were built, we find shards of this pottery from this class from the beginning. And sure, people lived in those old cabins and home places later. You say, well, that was later. Well, no, they took it down in layers, and the earliest layers show broken plates.
Right, they show every bit of this broken pieces that you see in the archaeology around these sites.
One of actually had it with them when they came.
If Dr. Charles Faulkner, who was a professor of anthropology here at University of Tennessee, he's recently passed away, but he did most all of the historic archaeology here in East Tennessee and the surrounding area. And one of the projects he worked on was the Nicholas Gibbs house in Knoxville. And in that archaeology, they listed so many different pieces of ceramic and this material that was in it, and that's an 18th century building. And I think it was destroyed by 1835. So everything was pre-1835 that was in the archaeology. And it's a tremendous amount of these pieces that were there. And even more so than this that we have here. And it was just a log building. Just a standard little East Tennessee log building. Story and a half, maybe an outbuilding or two.
Was any eating-ware related to the Cherokee peoples who had been in the area? Did they adapt any of that or use any of that, do you think?
I would think they would have, but I would think the Cherokees would have adapted to this too. We know that Ross did. We know that, who was the other famous, John Ross and the, who am I thinking of?
I can't help.
Oh, there were a couple of major Cherokee Indian people here. We know that Nancy Ward, actually, if you're familiar with the Nancy Ward story, and Lydia Bean. Have you heard that story before? Oh my goodness, you'll have to come to another session.
He can keep you here for a while.
Well, you know, from Charleston, we had traders here by
Oh yeah.
certainly 1740 or 50,
Yeah.
trading with the Cherokee, and so, you know, they were enamored by the things we had and traded for those
Yeah.
things all the time.
Settlers that would know that they were planning on moving westward when the territories opened up, they would still often sometimes carry dishes that they'd gotten when they got married, that their mother had passed down. And those would be things that were treasured to them, but maybe some of the other things, not so much. They might be able to replace those, but they had so little room in the wagon.
Yeah, and we notice in the store journals that when every now and then they'll buy a set of plates and dishes, and then they'll go back to the store maybe a year later, and they just buy one. Well, what's that tell you? One got broken. And they're replacing it. You know, so that's pretty much what we would have done today if we still needed that. Now, of course, they did not have the quantity of table items that we have today, the choice that we have today in our homes. I mean, that just wasn't feasible for them at that point in time. But they still had items that were nice to use, and they used them, and they purchased them. And so I think that's the message that Donna wanted to get across to everyone, is that when you're thinking about setting these tables, you know, think about what life was really like for them when they're setting their table for having a dinner, guest over for dinner. And I think that's what these whole seminars and eating events are going to be about, is to let them see what life was like at a special dinner in these homes. Your guest.
How about what was on the table, like cloths, and how about napkins and things? What would they have been like?
Well, there were linens. If we look at inventories and estate inventories, then one of the most expensive items you will see are linens that are itemized in the estate inventories, or linens. Usually bed linens and table linens. Those ones will always put in there. Any other questions?
Well, there's a book I didn't find out about until this year. It's called They May Do, and it shows how they would reuse any piece of this tableware to make something else useful out of it. And like even an egg basket would be laced back together with scraps of cloth when a handle would tear loose or something.
I've seen one of these repaired with wire about 4 times.
Yeah. And
They'll have
even
copper wire,
skillets.
brass wire, and it'll get broken, and they'll drill little holes in it, and they'll wire it back together.
So they may do. Everybody couldn't afford this. It's very true, because there wasn't any cash crops in Tennessee, and you just didn't come by a lot of usable things to exchange better things for.
Speaking of cleanup, that got me thinking too, is that so everything they had was pretty much reusable. In the modern day, we're used to being able to have things that are disposable that we throw away. Everything here you would have to reuse. So how much of a process was it to completely clean everything to use it again? Because, you know, we have to understand most people don't always have a bought river right next to the cabin and stuff like that. So like, what was the process for having to clean up after dinner?
Well, pretty much they had to locate close to water. They couldn't survive without the water. Either to drink it, to, you know, whatever, and it had to be fresh water that they could have access to. Now, very soon in the mid-19th century, you know, they're digging cisterns and wells, and there's probably some even earlier. They're already. We know that in Jamestown, in the 1600s, there's the Jamestown well. You know, so they were digging wells for fresh water. And so we knew they could do that if the ground would permit them to do it, and the water table was close enough for them to not have to dig so deep to get to it. But otherwise, they would locate next to water that's drinkable, and then they would use it to clean themselves and wash everything with.
Yes.
Now you had to go get it,
Mhm.
which meant you had to have the buckets
Mhm.
and the pails to go get it.
So would the same soap that they're buying from the store maybe for themselves would also be used for all this other stuff too? Would it be a one size fits all type solution, or was it just just clean it with the water and that's it?
Well, now, I have to say, I don't know exactly. I can just speculate on that because of the types of soap that were sold and the ability for them to make their own soap, which they did. They knew how to make soap. Soap had been being made for over 3,000 years.
Lion's fat.
And they typically only made it once a year when they killed the hogs.
Just in whenever.
Lion's fat.
Yeah.
That's all you
But
need.
they would make enough to last a year.
Well,
No.
sometimes they didn't last a year, but they
So-
did make as much as they could.
Yeah.
I understand.
And then they would, if they ran out, they would trade for it. If somebody that had more, had excess, they would trade for that.
All you need is ashes from the fire and fat from the hog,
Right.
and you got soap.
You got soap. And so they were making their own soap, but they were also buying soap. The Castile soap is actually almost like what we could consider today a soft soap that would have been used to scrub into the laundry.
It was made with olive oil. It's an olive oil soap.
And so that soap, we pretty well say the Castile soap was used for laundry cleaning and those sort of things. But the other bar soaps that are scented, if they're all used for laundry, I don't have the answer for that. It doesn't seem like the quantity would be for that at this point. When they've got the Castile and the soap they make already, it sort of leans itself that they're bathing with it. So.
And other than the functional pieces for dining, would there have been any kind of decorative stuff, vases with flowers, dried things, perhaps?
Eperns that sat on the table, 18th century. There's I think there's one in there that's a very decorative dish called for sweetmeats, and it's candied fruits. And it was a very decorative dish that was be set on the table. As a matter of fact, Martha Washington talks frequently about it in her work about using very decorative pieces on the table in Washington. Of course, Thomas Jefferson would have done the same thing. And as a matter of fact, what some research is developing now is we know that William being the first settler that comes into Tennessee, Lydia Russell is a cousin to George Washington. And so they're of that caliber of level of class of people. And we don't like to think about classes today, but they were very evident at that point in time. They're always trying to increase their level of their class system. And if they can't have the money, they're going to try to show it as best they can. And so these kinds of pieces, sometimes, like you're talking about, the decorative pieces, you have people over, that's to show your wealth and to show that, okay, maybe I was wealthy at one point, but maybe not so much now. And we did have what I call now, situational poverty. Today in East Tennessee, we have a lot of generational poverty, where from generations we have people that do not really aspire to increase their standard of living. But in that period of time, you would have people that would be very wealthy at one point. Something happened, you lose the male of the household, and the mother and the children then have no means of support. And so that situation makes them have to reduce their standard of living. A lot of the times the court would step in and help take care of the children by indenturing them out to other people. But still, that situational poverty happened until they had a way to increase their standard of living, their income, have a better crop that year. I know that my grandparents went through it, even still then. One year we'd have a very good crop of oranges, a couple of years, maybe the next year we didn't. And so that money was hard to come by the next year. And that setback may take 2 or 3 years to recover. And so those kinds of economic things played into effect as well.
I'm sure there was no one way of doing things, but can you sort of give us a general image of what a dinner party would be like? Were there invitations sent out paper-wise as opposed to verbal? Did the people come dressed up? Did they wait for a dinner bell to come sit down? How proper? Do you have any concept of that?
It would depend on your standing
Sure.
in the community. You would have cards that you would present your card, or you would receive a card from the lady of the house to be invited to your, and a servant or someone would deliver that card to you, and then you would know that that's your invitation to come. And so you would have those cards, just like we have business cards today. But if you remember graduating from high school, remember those little cards with your name on it? That's where that came from. I don't know if we do that anymore, but
Used to what I was thinking. You came in the house, you put your card like
that's exactly right. Put your card down. And so that was an invitation that you were invited to a dinner party. Now, another thing that becomes very obvious in this is that, of course, they did not have football games. They didn't have the sports games and TV that we have today, but that didn't mean that they were not social people. We find often men, women, and children buying dancing shoes. So why are they buying dancing shoes? Unless they're going to a gala, right? And so there's going to be a party, and they would have a party every so often. Another thing we find that they're buying a tremendous amount of fiddle strings for fiddles, for violins, so, and other strings for instruments. So they are having musical events going on all the time, social events. We call them barn dances, you know.
We just went to Williamsburg 2 weeks ago and went to the governor's mansion, and the one room that I remember them showing us, they had the furniture arranged in a specific manner so that they could clear it all to the sides and they could dance in the middle. That's what they did. When they had dinner parties, they danced. Yeah. And then there was music in there also.
And to, you know, what's blowing my mind is that here on what we call the frontier backcountry of Tennessee, in 1785 and 1790, we're having those kinds of dances. You know, we're having those kinds of events here. People are dressing up and coming out in their finest, in their dancing shoes, and having a good time.
Yeah, and one thing I don't understand yet, and I'm working to try to find it out, and that is how in the world did these people transfer their wealth from Virginia? For example, we had people moving to this area in the late 1700s, and they'd sold 500 acres of land and were tobacco farmers in Virginia. Now, what did they bring? Cash? Was it silk? You know, how did that? We know storekeepers were the banks at that time. You know, and much of it was bartered. But these people had some wealth when they left Upper Virginia and came all the way to Rockford, which, you know, is a good example. Here's a guy whose wife was a favorite dancer with George Washington, and 2 years later they're living in Rockford. And so they owned a plantation next to George Washington, and now they come in. Now what did they do with that wealth? Did they have it hid somewhere? In a money belt? No, I don't think so. But, you know, so how was that carried out? How was finance carried out at that time? And I don't know. I don't know. Didn't learn that in school. We didn't learn that.
Yes.
So one thing that occurred to me throughout this conversation that I know was something that happened is obviously just like anyone's house, no matter where you stood in the social, you would occasionally have somebody over at the house to hang out, talk, whatever. But how often was it that you could have somebody over for dinner if you were, let's say, I know there wasn't really technically a true middle class, but an average family? How often would you be able to have spare food to have somebody over for dinner? What went into that? Did you have to change up your dinner routine to have a guest over if you were just an average family?
Well, I'll have to refer back to my grandmother on that, and which she would have learned from her grandmother and great-grandmother too back in the 1800s. And it was truly amazing that all of a sudden we would have unexpected guests show up, and there may be 1, 2, or 3 people. And they show up in the middle of the afternoon. Well, if they show up and they have driven or walked or trained or buggied, whatever it was, to get to my grandparents' home, they were not prepared for anybody to come to eat. But yet my grandmother could make the biggest spread of food out of nothing that you could imagine. And so I think that was a talent and a skill they had to do, that they had learned to do that, and my grandmother never had any problem pulling it off. And we were not upper class people. We did not have a lot of food stored.
My grandmother was quite poor, and she would have said, you never turn anybody
You
away
never turn
to
anybody
eat.
down.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of stories from my own grandparents about such things, and I know that it's not as common of a tradition anymore. But I do know that when I've traveled, I've still experienced it. And I know my father talked about a lot when we traveled through Europe. That tradition is still very much alive and well.
It is in Europe. Where here, if somebody shows it up our house, we said, okay, where are we going to eat?
Yeah, you're going out somewhere, you're going something like that. And the at-home dining thing, it's not completely dead, obviously. We're still eating at home. But the tradition has changed over the past, I would say, 30, 40 years. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
No, I'll try to answer this young man. My family had a tradition, it was a big family. My family had a tradition, they always had a fairly large pantry in case something like this happened. And my family, aunts and uncles, always brought something to the house when they came.
Yep.
So, my dad's family, there was 10, okay? So, when they came, they opened up their trunk, and primarily the aunts, okay? The men brought a jug, okay? The women always reached in and picked up something and brought it in and put it on the table in the kitchen, whatever. So, it was the Boyce family tradition that if they were going to come in and they had planned something or they hadn't planned something, they always brought in enough to feed their family plus. Okay? So if there were 6 in their family, they brought enough to feed maybe 8 or 10. So
That's the saying, don't come empty-handed.
Okay. Now it may not been what you wanted to eat, but by God, there was enough to eat. Okay. So I grew up in Michigan, so I'm not a Southerner by any stretch of any's imagination in here. But that was the way it was.
It was, yeah.
In Michigan. If you went out to eat, and you had 6 in your family, you brought enough to feed 10. And when it got all over, my mom packed it all up and said, okay, here, put it back in your trunk and get the hell out of here.
So,
Well, now, and also to answer your question too, in living on a farm, which is probably a little different than living in a non-rural environment in a community or in town where you didn't have access to food that you had stored. Any southern farmhouse was going to have a smokehouse, and they're going to have meat in the smokehouse, and more than likely they're going to have chickens. So you're going to have, I know that anytime the preacher would come to our house on Sunday unexpected, well, a chicken lost his life. So it's like, and that's just the way it was. So
that actually leads me into another question I was thinking about while he was talking. Was that, so let's say I'm traveling through East Tennessee, I'm stopped in a rural community because that's just where the stagecoach place is, and I'm looking for a place to stay because there just happens to not be an inn nearby, right? And some family invites me over there. Would I have already anticipated oh, well, I already have some food in my trunk with me because I know that if I need to stay somewhere, it's proper for me to already bring food. It would be wrong of me, improper of me not to bring something to eat, something to the dinner table for myself, to contribute to that household that might be graciously letting me stay there, graciously letting me eat there.
That's a cultural issue that you grew up with, kind of thing. Yeah. And that, but like you did, that people would bring food. Well, where we lived, people didn't bring food. you know, they expected you to have something, you know, whether they were kin or not, actually. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna make a comment. When I was a child, my grandmother, as soon as she finished with breakfast dishes, she started making lunch, and she would make enough for probably 15 people. Always. Always. And one time I asked her, of course I like to play hooky and stay with her, but I asked her, why are you making somebody's going to stop by and have lunch? And invariably, people stopped by and had lunch.
And
just
you
like-
didn't even think anything about it.
No,
That's just the way it
that's
was.
just the way she did. It was always a couple of meats and 4 or 5 vegetables.
Right now, we have a tradition that if we go to someone's house for dinner, we'll take a bottle of wine. You know, we take a gift, whatever that gift is.
Right.
And in this case, maybe you would say, oh, I brought this for you, and just give it as a gift. They can serve it then, or they can serve it later, but that's your gift to them for coming and staying for a meal.
Yeah.
Linda would bring a cake.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you, Linda? Thank you, Ben.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you, Rhonda. We appreciate your giving us a full table full.
Well, there you go.
Appreciate it.
Let's
Very
give him a
well.
hand.
And good luck.
Where's the food?
Where's the food?
Where's the
Yeah.
chow?
I think that's coming.
Oh.